When my father's funeral rites ended and everyone gathered to discuss his money and assets, my brother-in-law, Brad, who is married to my sister Melissa, suddenly declared that everything, including the $10 million inheritance, should go to Melissa, the eldest sibling. My sister and Brad seemed thrilled at the idea, but the lawyer quickly shut them down, reminding them that they couldn't make such decisions on their own. Hello everyone, my name is Paul Jacobs. I'm 44, work in sales, and have a wife and 2 kids. My father owned a significant share of a company, and even at his age, continued working. Melissa, who is older than me, had always been a source of trouble for our parents, mainly due to her reckless behavior. Despite being well into her 52s, she never held a steady job and lived life on her own terms. We never got along, so I kept my distance. Then, out of nowhere, when she turned 52, Melissa announced that she was getting married. The man she brought home, Brad Evans, was younger and good-looking, but lazy and unpleasant. Melissa started asking Dad for money to fund the wedding like it was nothing, blowing through it quickly, and then having the nerve to ask for more. Dad was furious, but she acted like it didn't matter because she expected to inherit everything eventually. I just watched her with cold detachment. Less than a year after their wedding, Dad had a heart attack while playing golf and passed away. It hit me hard, and I was deeply saddened. His sudden death shocked his friends, and our phones wouldn't stop ringing with condolences. But I couldn't just sit and grieve. I had to take charge of the funeral arrangements and help my devastated mother. As usual, Melissa was nowhere to be found, off doing her own thing. After the funeral, Mom and I finally had a moment to breathe. But the next day, a lawyer arrived to discuss Dad's will. Mom and I were already familiar with its contents, but Melissa and Brad barged in, completely clueless, and dropped a bombshell. All of Dad's assets and the $10 million inheritance should go to Melissa, the oldest daughter, so hands off. Mom and I were stunned by their audacity. We did it, Melissa. We're set for life. Brad cheered, fist pumping in excitement. The lawyer, surprised, quickly intervened. Hold on a minute. Melissa glared at him as he continued, Melissa, you're not entitled to any inheritance. Both Melissa and Brad were shocked. That can't be right. Melissa's the eldest daughter. She should get everything. Brad protested. It was clear he had been banking on that inheritance, assuming Melissa would get it all. Their expressions shifted as the lawyer spoke again, this time more gently. Did you not know? Melissa is not Mr. Jacobs' biological child. Melissa's face went pale, and she looked at our mother in disbelief. Mom, what does this mean? She stammered, her voice shaking. Our mother, clearly uncomfortable, finally admitted, Melissa, you're from my previous marriage. Melissa, who had often teased me about being Dad's favorite child, now stood there in shock. Brad, still in denial, asked, but she was adopted, right? That should still give her inheritance rights. Our mother shook her head. There was no legal adoption. Brad and Melissa were incredulous. This can't be. I'm the eldest daughter. Dad even said so. Melissa yelled, turning her anger toward me. I'm not going to let you take everything. She snapped. I was tired of her entitlement. After everything Dad did for you, you're still acting like this. Be quiet. I'm his rightful heir. Melissa and Brad tried to argue, but I cut them off. It's not wrong for a father to support his daughter, but you've taken advantage of Dad, using his money to cover your debts and problems. Our mother, Mrs. Jacobs, who had been quiet until then, suggested, why don't we show Melissa the will? Melissa panicked, admitting she had no idea what it said. She had ignored Dad's wishes when he wanted to discuss it, preferring to go out instead. Brad shot her an angry glare, clearly frustrated. They reluctantly agreed to hear the will. The lawyer revealed that the inheritance was designated for me and my mother. The will also explained why Dad never adopted Melissa. He had intended to, but over time, her behavior toward me and her reckless spending led him to change his mind. Melissa was stunned. So I have no inheritance rights at all, she muttered, clearly upset. Then Brad's voice rose in anger. You lied to me. You said you had money. His demeanor turned aggressive, leaving both my mother and Melissa shocked. But I wasn't surprised. Brad had always shown signs of greed. Perhaps he had married Melissa for her money. Don't come back until you've got some money, he barked at her. Brad, what are you talking about? I thought I was going to be wealthy. Melissa cried as he stormed out, leaving her behind. Melissa glared at us, her face twisted with rage. Mom, why didn't you adopt me? It's not fair that Paul gets everything. I should have gotten something too. Her outburst left me stunned. But the lawyer remained unfazed, clearly used to such family drama. Why does he get everything? She demanded. Because I'm Dad's son, I replied. Melissa's eyes filled with anger, and she lunged at me, shouting, You should have never been born. I thought to myself that even if I hadn't existed, Dad would likely have made the same decision, given Melissa's character. Before I could say anything, the lawyer calmly intervened. Melissa, if you continue like this, the police will get involved. Melissa flinched, perhaps recalling her past shoplifting incidents. 6 months later, the inheritance process went smoothly. Despite some grumbling from Melissa and Brad, the lawyer's efficient management left them no room to interfere. My mother gave Melissa some money, but I chose not to comment on it. What bothered me most was their sudden disappearance with the funds, displaying their blatant gold-digging behavior, which left a bad impression on our relatives who knew about the situation. One day, I took my mother, wife, and daughter out for a meal. Thanks to my wife's suggestion, my mother, who had been somewhat withdrawn since Dad's passing, seemed more cheerful in the company of her admirable granddaughter. Hey, Mom, why don't you come live with us? I proposed. But you know, Melissa might drop by sometimes. She only shows up when she needs money, right? Don't be too accommodating with her, I warned. My mother hesitated, understandably reluctant to abandon her biological daughter. If our family moved into the family home, Melissa might stir up trouble again. Respecting her concerns, I simply asked her to think it over as we drove towards the family home to drop her off. When we arrived, we noticed the lights on in the supposedly empty house. It wasn't the time for the housekeeper to be there, so I wondered if Melissa had returned. With that in mind, I parked the car in the garage. Let's go in for a quick coffee, I suggested. As we stepped out of the car and approached the entrance, a vehicle suddenly swerved toward us, narrowly missing us. Reacting to my daughter's cry, I instinctively shielded my wife. The car grazed me, and I was thrown into a nearby flower bed, taking a hard knock. The car came to a halt after hitting the garage entrance. Are you okay, honey? My wife and daughter rushed over to help me up, while my mother stood trembling at the entrance, understandably shaken. Chaos ensued, and I was rushed to the hospital by ambulance, where I had to stay overnight. Later, I learned that the driver was Brad. He claimed to the police that he mistook the accelerator for the brake, but I didn't believe him. When my mother and Melissa visited me in the hospital, Melissa looked at me coldly and remarked, "You're surprisingly resilient, aren't you?" I couldn't help but think that if I had been seriously injured, my mother would have inherited everything. "Too bad for you," I said with a smirk. Melissa visibly tensed. "You were counting on it, weren't you?" I asked. She looked away, uncomfortable. "Well, Mom told me she plans to waive her inheritance for me, so causing such an accident was pointless," I continued. Melissa seemed shocked by this revelation. It was inconceivable to her that someone would refuse an inheritance. "I have a wife and kids, so Mom asked me to pass it on to them. That's what parents do." But Melissa stammered. "I even made a will early on. Following Dad's example," I added, leaving Melissa speechless. "So, unfortunately, my share won't be going to Mom anymore." Melissa trembled as she stared at me. "Can't you at least give me something? There's $10 million, right?" When I firmly refused, her face twisted with fury, and she grabbed my collar. "Give me half. I'm your sister. I looked at her with pity as she continued screaming in an unsettling tone, driven to madness by the prospect of the inheritance. "Don't you realize that your greed would disappoint, Dad?" Melissa's face flushed with anger as she reached for my throat. "Melissa, what are you doing?" Our mother cried out, her voice raised as nurses arrived to escort Melissa out of the hospital room. Although my mother seemed inclined to defend Melissa, it was clear that Melissa had directed her anger toward our mother too. "Where did I go wrong in raising her?" my mother said, her voice filled with sadness. Shortly after, my mother fell ill, and as her condition worsened, my wife and I stepped in to help with transportation and household tasks at the family home. This seemed to upset Melissa, who had been visiting to ask for money or had heard about our assistance from our mother. One day, Melissa called me abruptly. "From now on, we'll take care of Mom. You two don't need to come anymore," she declared. "What is this all about?" I tried to reason with her, but she wouldn't listen and hung up. Concerned about her lack of experience in caregiving, I quickly contacted my mother. Surprisingly, Brad had some caregiving experience. At that point, my mother was still fairly independent, so it seemed manageable, and I felt somewhat relieved. However, within a month, my mother was rushed to the hospital by ambulance due to a medication dosage error. She looked alarmingly frail when we arrived. The doctor was puzzled because my mother had never made such a mistake before. While my wife stayed with her, I returned to the family home, only to find it in disarray. The fridge was empty, despite my mother's love for cooking, and it seemed the housekeeper had been dismissed without any discussion. I felt ashamed for trusting Melissa, and I was furious. A significant amount of money had been withdrawn from my mother's bank account, even though her bank card and PIN were secured in the safe. Thankfully, the account containing the inheritance remained untouched in a safe deposit box, but most of the funds meant for living expenses were gone. I gathered essentials for my mother's hospital stay, along with her bank card, and returned to explain the situation to her. "Did Melissa?" I began, but my mother seemed unaware of the bank card issue. When I asked about the medication error, she looked somber and confessed that Brad had prepared the medication. "Mom, maybe it's best not to let Melissa into the house anymore," I suggested. "Paul, I promised to take care of you, but the house is in such disarray, and you've lost so much weight. Have you been eating properly?" my mother asked, her words weighing heavily on me. "Mom, you should come live with us. I'll build a home where we can all be together," I proposed, causing my mother to break down in tears. However, despite the doctor's best efforts, my mother's health continued to decline. Perhaps the stress from Melissa's behavior had weakened her. She never recovered and eventually passed away, almost as if she had followed my father. When I returned to the family home to arrange the funeral, I discovered that all the valuables had vanished. It seemed Melissa and Brad had taken them in their desperate pursuit of money. Standing amidst the empty rooms, I was first shocked and then consumed by a fierce anger. I vowed to hold them accountable for their actions. The day after my mother's funeral, Melissa and I were scheduled to meet with the lawyer, presumably to discuss the inheritance. "Too bad, Paul. Mom's inheritance rightfully belongs to me, her daughter," Melissa boldly declared. I couldn't help but chuckle at her statement. "Let's see what the will says," I suggested. When the lawyer unveiled the will, Melissa's face drained of color. "No, this can't be. Melissa is not entitled to inherit anything. That's Dad's final wish." Brad exploded in anger, but the lawyer calmly reiterated the same statement. "This is absurd. Melissa is that old woman's biological child," Brad shouted, sweeping items off the table in frustration. "Did you try to harm my mom?" I confronted him. "What? I never did such a thing," Brad retorted angrily. "Then why was there a mistake with her medication?" I pressed. Brad scowled in annoyance. "Who cares about that, Paul? It's outrageous that we're not getting any inheritance." Melissa, losing her composure, interjected. "What have you done, Paul?" "I'm getting nothing." The lawyer carefully explained the legal distribution of the inheritance, However, after deducting the amount Melissa had withdrawn and the items she had sold, there was almost nothing left. She scratched her head in frustration. This outcome was reached after consulting with the lawyer in advance. I interjected. "That can't be. It can't be this little," Melissa muttered, clearly dissatisfied. Having relied on our parents without ever facing the hardships of work, she seemed completely out of touch with reality. I couldn't contain my contempt for her. "Mom thought you'd take care of her, but you just took her money and abandoned her. You're ungrateful." Melissa shot back. "Taking care of someone costs money, you know." "Then show me the detailed expenses you used for Mom's living costs." "I'll cover the necessary expenses," I challenged her, extending my hand. Melissa's face paled, and her lips trembled. I don't have that." "Without receipts, it won't be recognized," the lawyer emphasized, leaving Melissa speechless. Facing her, Brad attempted to sway me with a pleading tone. "Paul, your sister really needs help. Can't you lend her a hand, even just a little?" I firmly declined, feeling my frustration growing. It seemed Brad was reaching his limit too. If everything had gone as planned, Melissa would have had the entire inheritance by now, he muttered. "What do you mean by that?" I questioned, but before I could delve deeper, Brad let slip a revealing comment. "Because of this guy, nothing ever goes smoothly. I was supposed to get a new car, but all I got was barely enough for repairs." Melissa desperately tried to interject, but it was too late. "That's a serious accusation. It sounds like fraud," the lawyer remarked, holding her recorder and smiling at the couple. "What? That's illegal," I exclaimed. "I clearly stated at the outset that this meeting would be recorded, and you both agreed to it," the lawyer said, watching as Brad paled upon realizing his mistake. Turning to him, I declared, "Brad, I'll be pressing charges for that accident." "Don't be absurd. There's no evidence," Brad shot back. "You've just provided the evidence yourself," I replied. Melissa burst into tears and shook Brad in frustration. "You fool. It's all your fault. What are we going to do now?" Eventually, Brad faced criminal charges, and his previous offenses came to light, leading to his detention by the police. Melissa, implicated as an accomplice, received a lesser sentence. However, unable to afford her rent, she sought help from relatives, but was rejected by everyone. As for me, I continued to work diligently, without relying on any inheritance, and lived a peaceful life.